The air inside the Manchester arena was thick with tension, the kind that settled deep in the bones of those who truly understood what was at stake. Under the harsh glare of the overhead lights, the ring stood like a battlefield waiting for its warriors. The crowd buzzed with an electric energy, a symphony of cheers and murmurs weaving together as anticipation gripped every soul in attendance. At ringside, a figure sat with the practiced stillness of a man who had seen it all before, his sharp eyes locked onto the canvas where two heavyweights were about to write the next chapter of their careers. Lennox Lewis, a legend whose name still carried the weight of championship glory, watched with the intensity of someone who knew the price of greatness. He had seen young men rise and fall, had felt the raw power of ambition colliding with experience, and tonight, he was searching for something that would tell him what was coming next in the ever-evolving saga of heavyweight boxing. Joseph Parker stood in his corner, his expression unreadable, the New Zealand flag stitched onto his trunks barely shifting as he took measured breaths. He had been here before, under the scrutiny of thousands, the weight of expectation pressing against him. Across from him, Martin Bakole bounced on his toes, a hulking figure with destruction in his fists. He had no fear, only intent. The bell rang, and the two men met in the center, a collision of skill and power, each testing the other, waiting for the moment to seize control. Lennox barely moved, his hands clasped, eyes narrowed. He was studying, processing. Every movement, every angle, every micro-adjustment told him something about the fighters in the ring. It wasn't just about who would win tonight. It was about what this fight revealed about the division's future, about the men standing at the precipice of the next big opportunity. The first round was a tactical chess match, Parker's quick hands flicking out jabs, his footwork crisp as he stayed just outside of Bakole's reach. But Bakole wasn't here to play games. The Congolese powerhouse stalked forward, absorbing shots, waiting for his chance to explode. Then it happened midway through the second round. Bakole unleashed a devastating right hand that crashed against Parker's temple, sending a shudder through the crowd. Parker stumbled but didn't fall, his legs threatening betrayal as he clinched instinctively. Lennox leaned forward slightly, the movement almost imperceptible, his expert mind already dissecting the moment. Parker was hurt but composed, surviving the onslaught, slipping punches even as his body screamed for recovery time. It was this kind of moment that separated contenders from champions, the ability to walk through fire and emerge stronger. By the fourth round, Parker had found his rhythm again, his shots sharper, his movements smoother. The tension in the arena thickened as the fight tilted back and forth, each man forcing the other to dig deeper. And then, in the eighth, everything changed. A perfectly timed left hook detonated against Bakole's jaw, a shot that came from nowhere, catching him in the middle of an exchange. The sound of the impact cracked through the air like a gunshot, and Bakole's body betrayed him, his legs giving out as he collapsed to the canvas. The arena erupted as the referee began the count, the seconds stretching endlessly. Lennox didn't need to wait for the official decision, he knew. This fight was over. Joseph Parker had made his statement. As the referee waved his arms, signaling the knockout, Parker raised his gloves in quiet triumph, the weight of the victory sinking in. The cameras panned to Lennox, catching the slight nod of approval, the knowing look in his eyes. He had seen what he needed to see. But his thoughts weren't just on Parker. No, there was another name lingering in his mind, another fighter who had been watching this battle just as closely. Daniel Dubois. A man with something to prove. A man whose path was inching ever closer to Parker's. Backstage, the air was thick with the lingering energy of the fight. Conversations buzzed through the hallways, journalists scrambling for reactions, trainers analyzing every second of the bout. Parker, his face glistening with sweat, spoke to the cameras, his words measured, but his eyes betraying the fire that still burned within. I knew it was going to be tough. Bakole's a dangerous guy, but I trusted my team, trusted my power. I had to show people what I'm about. His voice was steady, But even as he spoke, he knew what was coming next. The questions were inevitable. And then it happened. A journalist leaned in, voice cutting through the noise. "Joseph, do you think this performance proves you're ready for Daniel Dubois?" A pause. A slight shift in Parker's stance. Then a small smirk. "I've always been ready." Somewhere in the crowd of media personnel, Lennox Lewis watched without a word, his expression unreadable. He had been thinking about that very question all night. Parker had delivered a statement, but Dubois was a different kind of beast. Younger, hungrier, still carrying the sting of past failures but with the power to erase any doubts in a single moment. And soon, their paths would collide. Lennox had seen the patterns before, knew the way history worked in this sport. It wasn't just about skill. It was about timing, about who could take their moment and seize it with both hands. As Parker disappeared into the locker room, his team surrounding him, another figure stepped into the corridor, the bright lights catching the sharp edges of his determined expression. Daniel Dubois. He had been watching. He had been listening. And he had been waiting. Lennox exhaled slowly, already hearing the echoes of the battle that had yet to begin. The heavyweight division was shifting once more, and the war was only just beginning. Lennox Lewis remained in his seat long after the cameras had moved on, his mind a battlefield of thoughts as the echoes of the knockouts still hung in the air. He had seen it all before, one fighter proving himself under the bright lights, another waiting in the shadows, knowing his moment would come soon. The heavyweight division was a dangerous place, an arena where one punch could rewrite legacies, where the difference between triumph and obscurity was often a fraction of a second. Joseph Parker had made his statement, but the question lingering in the air was no longer just about him. It was about Daniel Dubois. Lennox had watched him before, had seen the promise in the young fighter's hands, the raw power that could break a man in half. But power alone wasn't enough. Not in this game. It was the battles outside the ring, the demons a fighter carried with him, that often determined whether he could rise when the moment demanded it. And tonight, as Dubois stood in the corridor, watching Parker's victory replayed on screens around the arena, Lennox knew the young heavyweight was already waging a war within himself. Dubois wasn't a man of many words. He never had been. Everything he needed to say, he said with his fists. But as he stood there, watching Parker walk past surrounded by his team, something flickered in his eyes. A challenge. A hunger that couldn't be disguised. He had been here before, in the position of the hunter, waiting for his opportunity to strike. And yet, there was something different this time. The sting of past mistakes still clung to him, memories of the night he had tasted defeat burning like an ember in his chest. He had learned the hard way that being a heavy puncher wasn't enough. He had faced adversity, had been questioned, doubted. And now, here he was again, at the doorstep of another defining moment. A fight with Parker wasn't just another bout. It was a crossroads, a moment that would decide whether he was destined for greatness or if the whispers of his critics carried truth. Lennox had seen it in fighters before. That moment when the weight of expectation pressed down like an anvil, where doubt and belief waged war inside a man's mind. He could see it in Dubois now, the quiet turmoil hidden behind his steady gaze. It wasn't just about skill or power. It was about whether he could handle the pressure, whether he could walk into a fight knowing that one mistake could cost him everything. And Parker, fresh off his victory, wasn't about to make it easy. He had tasted the sting of underestimation before, had been counted out by those who thought they understood this game. But tonight, he had reminded the world who he was. And he wasn't done yet. Somewhere in the arena, reporters were already shaping the narrative. The whispers had started before Parker had even left the ring. Who was next? Was this the performance that put him back among the division's elite? And more importantly, was Daniel Dubois ready for the challenge? The cameras searched for him, waiting for a reaction, for a hint of what was to come. But Dubois remained still, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tight. He knew the question was coming before the microphone was even in his face. A reporter, his voice careful yet probing, stepped forward. "Daniel, after watching Parker's performance tonight, do you think you're ready for him?" A pause. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. Dubois glanced at the screen one last time, watching the slow-motion replay of Parker's knockout punch, the way Bakole had crumbled under its force. And then, with a voice steady but low, he answered, "I've been ready." It wasn't loud. It wasn't boastful. But there was a certainty in it, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Lennox heard it, felt the gravity behind the words. Dubois wasn't just saying it. He believed it. But belief wasn't enough. He would have to prove it. As the night wore on, the arena slowly emptied, the echoes of battle fading into the corridors and locker rooms. Parker sat with his team, his hands still wrapped, the adrenaline beginning to wear off. He had done what he needed to do, but he knew his next challenge was already taking shape. He had seen Dubois watching, had felt the tension in the air. It wasn't just speculation anymore. It was inevitable. And in this sport, inevitability had a way of turning into something brutal. Lennox finally rose from his seat, his mind still calculating, analyzing, seeing beyond what most could. The division was shifting again, the pieces moving into place for another war. Parker had reminded the world who he was. Dubois was waiting to remind them who he could become. And somewhere in the midst of it all, history was preparing to repeat itself. The question wasn't just about who would win. It was about who could survive. The air in the arena had settled, but the tension surrounding what was to come only grew thicker in the hours that followed. The whispers were no longer just speculation. They had turned into something more, a slow-building storm that now had weight behind it. Joseph Parker had made his statement, Daniel Dubois had responded with a promise, and now, the world was watching as the inevitable collision inched closer. But behind the carefully constructed facades, beyond the cameras and media-driven narratives, the real battle was already underway, not in the ring, but in the minds of those preparing to step into it. In a sport where confidence could be as fragile as a glass gin, the real war always started long before the first punch was thrown. And tonight, Lennox Lewis knew that both men were already feeling the weight of what lay ahead. Parker sat in his locker room, the adrenaline slowly wearing off, leaving behind the dull ache of a hard-fought battle. His team spoke in low tones around him, voices discussing strategies, future plans, possible matchups. But Parker wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of the fight, dissecting every movement. He had won, but the fight had revealed things about him, both strengths and weaknesses that his next opponent would be watching closely. And Dubois was watching. That much was certain. Parker had seen it in his eyes, the quiet intensity, the restrained hunger of a man waiting for his chance. And it wasn't just about rankings or title shots. This fight, when it happened, would be personal in ways the public wouldn't understand. It was about proving something, about redemption and the right to claim the future of the heavyweight division. Parker had been here before, had fought his way through doubt and dismissal, had endured the highs and lows that came with a career at the top level. But Dubois was different. Younger, still burning with the fire of a man who hadn't yet reached his full potential. And that made him dangerous. But Parker wasn't the only one burdened by what lay ahead. Across town, in a gym where the echoes of old battles still clung to the air, Dubois was already at work. He hadn't gone home. He hadn't allowed himself to celebrate, or enjoy the satisfaction of knowing his name was once again at the center of the conversation. Instead, he had wrapped his hands, laced up his gloves, and stepped into the ring, the rhythmic thud of his punches against the heavy bag the only sound in the dimly lit space. His trainer watched him closely, reading his movements, studying the way he carried himself. There was something different in him tonight, an edge that hadn't been there before. This wasn't just preparation. This was something deeper, something raw. And it wasn't just about Parker. No, this was about all the ghosts that still lingered in the back of Dubois' mind, the doubts that had crept in after his loss, the quiet whispers that had questioned whether he was built for this. He had silenced them once before, but now they threatened to return. And he knew that the only way to shut them out for good was to step into that ring and leave no doubt. Lennox Lewis had seen this kind of energy before, had witnessed firsthand the way a fighter could either rise under pressure or crumble beneath it. And as he sat back in his hotel room, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face, he scrolled through the reactions pouring in from around the boxing world. The opinions were divided. Some believed Parker's experience would prove too much, that his ability to adapt in the ring would expose the holes in Dubois' game. Others saw Dubois as the new force in the division, his power too overwhelming, his youth too relentless. Lennox understood both perspectives, but what troubled him wasn't the physical attributes of either fighter, it was what was happening beneath the surface. The emotions that were beginning to take root, the way this fight was shifting from a contest of skill to something far more personal. And then, just as he was about to close the screen, something caught his eye. A name. A name that had no business being in this conversation. The headline was short, almost subtle in the way it was tucked between the endless breakdowns of Parker's knockout win. But its implications were anything but subtle. A former champion, one who had been absent from the division for years, was suddenly being linked to the conversation. No confirmation. No official statement. Just whispers. But in boxing, whispers had a way of turning into something real. Lennox narrowed his eyes, reading between the lines, understanding what this could mean. If this was true, if this name was truly about to resurface, then everything about Parker versus Dubois would change. The stakes would be higher, the consequences far more dangerous. Because if there was one thing that history had proven time and time again, it was that when a forgotten champion returned, it was never just to watch from the sidelines. They came back for a reason. And that reason was always to take back what was once theirs. Lennox exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Parker and Dubois were locked on a collision course, a fight that would shape the future of the division. But now, there was a new piece on the board, an element neither man had accounted for. And if this shadow from the past truly was making a return, then the war that was coming wasn't going to be just between Parker and Dubois. It was going to be something far more unpredictable, something that could shake the entire division to its core. And neither of them saw it coming. The night of the fight arrived like a storm on the horizon, slow building but inevitable. The anticipation had reached a fever pitch, the air thick with tension as the arena filled with thousands of restless voices. This wasn't just another fight. This was a battle for respect, for redemption, for a future that could only belong to one of them. Joseph Parker stood in his locker room, his hands wrapped, his eyes fixed on his reflection in the mirror. The weight of experience sat heavy on his shoulders, but it wasn't burdening him, it was fueling him. He had been here before, had walked this road countless times, had felt the familiar pull of expectation. But something about this night felt different. The stakes were higher, the consequences sharper. He knew Dubois was dangerous, knew the younger fighter had something to prove. And a man with something to prove was always the most unpredictable kind of opponent. But Parker wasn't here to play the role of stepping stone. He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let this be his end. Across the arena, in another locker room filled with the same energy of war, Daniel Dubois sat in silence, his gloves already on, his body still but his mind restless. He had spent weeks drowning in the noise, hearing the endless debates, feeling the doubt that lingered in the voices of those who still questioned him. But all of that ended tonight. There was no past, no criticism, no ghosts left to haunt him. Just a man waiting for him in the ring and the opportunity to take everything Parker had worked for. Dubois knew what this fight meant. If he won, he wasn't just back, he was undeniable. But if he lost? No, there was no room for that thought. Not now. He clenched his fists, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of his gloves like an extension of himself. This was his moment, and nothing was going to stop him from taking it. The roar of the crowd swelled as both men made their walks to the ring, Parker moving with the calm confidence of a man who had done this before, Dubois with the steady intensity of a fighter who was ready to burn his name into history. The energy was electric, a live wire crackling between them as they stood in the center of the ring, the referee speaking but neither truly listening. Their eyes locked, no words exchanged, but everything understood. And then, the bell rang. The opening rounds were tense, either man willing to make the first critical mistake. Parker, the veteran, was patient, calculated, reading Dubois' movements, searching for patterns. Dubois, younger and hungrier, pressed forward, his power evident in every shot he threw. The crowd was on edge, the air thick with the kind of anticipation that only comes in fights where everything is on the line. Parker landed crisp combinations, using his experience to control the tempo, but Dubois absorbed them, unfazed, waiting for his moment to let his power explode. And then, in the fifth round, it happened. A sharp exchange at the center of the ring. A momentary lapse in Parker's defense. And then Dubois unleashed a right hand that sent shockwaves through the arena. Parker staggered, his legs betraying him for the briefest of moments, but his heart carried him forward. He clinched, survived, steadied himself, but the message had been sent. Dubois was not here to be outclassed. The crowd erupted, sensing the tide shifting, and suddenly, the fight became something different. It wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about will. Parker responded like a man who had no intention of fading. He dug deep, firing back with precision, making Dubois pay for every inch he took. The fight turned brutal, a war of attrition where both men refused to break. The rounds blurred together, sweat and blood mixing under the bright lights, the sound of leather crashing against flesh echoing through the arena. But then, just when it seemed like neither man could find the edge they needed, everything changed. The 11th round. The exhaustion visible in both men's eyes, but the determination still burning. Parker, moving forward, trying to break Dubois down with a relentless pace. Dubois waiting, looking for that one final moment. And then, out of nowhere, Parker threw a left hook meant to close the show. But Dubois saw it. He slipped just enough, planted his feet, and let loose a counter right hand with every ounce of strength he had left. It landed clean. Devastating. Parker's body betrayed him before his mind could react. His legs folded beneath him, and he crashed to the canvas in a silence so stark it was almost deafening. The referee began to count, the world watching, breath held, waiting to see if Parker could defy the odds one more time. But this time, there was no comeback. No rally. No miracle. The count reached 10. And just like that, it was over. Dubois stood in the center of the ring, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, his face a mixture of exhaustion and realization. He had done it. He had silenced every doubt, proved every critic wrong. This wasn't just a win. This was his arrival. And yet, as he raised his hands in victory, something unexpected happened. A movement at the edge of the ring. A figure stepping through the ropes. And suddenly, the energy shifted. The returning champion. The shadow from the past. The name that had no business being in this conversation. He stepped into the ring, eyes locked on Dubois, a slow, knowing smile forming. The crowd erupted in shock, the whispers turning into roars. This wasn't over. Not even close. Dubois had won the battle. But the war? The war was just beginning.